Hi, I'm Miss Dell from Muskrat Academia, and today we'll be going over clauses. So what is a clause? Well, it's a group of words with a subject and main verb. There are two main types of clauses, independent or main clauses. There are also dependent or subordinate clauses. The only difference between the two types of clauses is whether or not the clause can stand by itself. Independent clauses can stand by themselves because they have meaning, while dependent clauses cannot stand by themselves because they do not have meaning. So independent clause is a group of words with a subject, main verb, and meaning. For example, I Googled. I is our subject and Googled is our verb. And we have meaning. Who Googled? I did. What did I do? I Googled. What confuses me is when something I need ceases to exist. So if we're looking through the sentence, we see no prepositional phrases, but we do have an infinitive, to exist. And then our verb is going to be is. What is? What confuses me is when something I need ceases to exist. We also have need and ceases as our verbs. What need? When something I need, ceases is our verb, and then something I need is our entire subject, because what ceases to exist? Something I need. So this is actually kind of a sneak peek into what we'll be getting to in just another minute. What confuses me is actually an independent clause all by itself. When something I need ceases to exist is a dependent clause. It cannot stand by itself. And we'll be getting more into that on the next page. My mother fed me snake. No prepositional phrases, but fed is our verb and mother is our subject. My mother fed me snake. Stand by itself, it's an independent clause. Something to note is that all three of these sound like sentences, and that's because they are sentences. Independent clauses are sentences by themselves. Dependent clauses are not, because they have a subject and a verb, but they do not have meaning. For example, while Sally Googled. Googled is our subject, Sally is our verb. Sally Googled. However, we have that while out in front. While Sally Googled is not a full sentence. It cannot stand by itself. While Sally Googled, something else happened, but we're not told what that something else is. Thus, this is just a dependent clause and not independent. Until it ceased to exist. Well, no prepositional phrases, but we have to exist again. Ceased is our verb and it is our subject. Until it ceased to exist. Well, this also doesn't have meaning because something was happening up until the point it ceased to exist. Thus, this is a dependent clause and not independent. Because the internet failed. What failed? The internet did. What happened because the internet failed? Well, a lot of horrible things will happen, but we're not told what that was. What happened because the internet failed? Thus, this is another dependent clause. Using the independent clauses, which is abbreviated here as I, and dependent clauses, which is abbreviated here as D, we can create a lot of different sentences. Four are simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. Simple sentences are just one independent clause by itself. If you have more than one independent clause, but no dependent clauses, you have a compound sentence. If you have one independent clause and at least one dependent clause, you have a complex sentence. If you have at least two independent clauses and at least one dependent clause, you have a compound complex sentence. Just to note, compound complex is called compound complex because you're taking the compound, putting it in there, and you're also taking the dependent of the complex and putting it in there. These INDs can be in any order. So you see IID down here, this could be IDI, this could be IDII, or IIDDI. It just depends on how it works in a sentence. And as long as you are grammatically correct, you can put them in any order, for the most part. So examples of some simple sentences. Now remember, simple sentences are just I by itself, an independent clause. Scout was the cutest pumpkin ever. We have no prepositional phrases. Our verb is was. Who was? Scout was. Scout was the cutest pumpkin ever. Simple sentence, independent clause, can stand by itself. The mucus-coated gray mush of Jethro's brain slid down his throat. A couple prepositional phrases. Down his throat. Throat is our noun of the preposition. Of Jethro's brain is another prepositional phrase. Brain is our noun of the preposition. Looking for verbs, we have slid. What slid? The mush slid. So if we are breaking this down, our subject is mush. Our verb is slid. Mush slid. Then we put on all this other fluff stuff to make it sound really nice and pretty. Gray is actually an adjective describing mush. Mucus-coated is describing mush, and the is describing mush. So we have three adjectives, our subject, prepositional phrase, verb, prepositional phrase, and this is still a simple sentence, an independent clause. I love rainbows. Yeah, That's a simple sentence. Compound sentences, remember, are at least two independent clauses together with no dependent clauses. So this plus how many more I's you want, right? But no dependent clauses. Example. My mother eats fries, but I am not allowed any brownies. No prepositional phrases, but we do have eats for one of our verbs, and am allowed is more verbs. Not is acting as an adverb. Do not get confused there. It's modifying our verbs. So mother, who eats? Mother does. Specifically my mother. My is an adjective. My mother eats. Who is not allowed? I. And then we have a conjunction here, but and a comma before it. So my mother eats fries. Then we have a conjunction. So this can stand by itself. That's independent. I am not allowed any brownies. That can also stand by itself. It's independent. We have two independent clauses, compound sentence. To save the earth, we need to not destroy it, and this seems difficult. Any prepositional phrases? Nope, but we do have some to's here. So to save is an infinitive. To not destroy is another infinitive, except the not here, again, is acting as an adverb, even though it's kind of thrown in the middle of that infinitive phrase. This is actually called a split infinitive, because usually you want infinitives, depending on who you ask. Infinitive phrases are supposed to be together with nothing in between, but there is this not here, so it's called a split infinitive. So need is our verb, and we have another verb here, seems, and look, we have a conjunction, and, comma, and, right? To save the earth, we need. Who needs? We. What seems? This. Subject verb, right? To save the earth, we need to not destroy it. That's independent, comma, conjunction. This seems difficult. Also independent. Two independent clauses, compound sentence. He died, we dug, but nobody asked where Clint had been. All right, no prepositional phrases, but we have died, dug, asked, had been. They should all have double lines because that's what I like to go by. He is our subject. Who died? He did. Who dug? We dug. Who asked? Nobody, which is kind of sad. We can circle the conjunction right away, comma, conjunction. Who had been? Clint had been. He died. This is a semicolon. It can be used under specific circumstances, which will be explained later. Just know that it's used here, and it's indicating that, hey, we got an independent clause. We dug, comma, conjunction, another independent clause. Nobody asked. This is independent clause. This sentence here is not a compound sentence. Why? Because we have independent, where Clint had been. This cannot stand by itself. It is a dependent clause. Independent, dependent. As soon as you have that dependent in there, this is no longer a compound sentence. It has to have complex. So we have more than one I, more than one independent clause, and we have at least one dependent clause. So this is a compound, complex sentence. Complex sentences have to have at least one D in it and only one independent clause. This is my wonderful handwriting. My mouse handwriting. So at least one. How would you do that? Greater than or equal to one? Yeah, that looks good. So for example, while the house burned, he laughed and laughed and laughed. There are no prepositional phrases. So let's look at our verbs. Burned, we have laughed and laughed and laughed. Okay, and both ands are our conjunctions. What burned? House did. Who laughed? He laughed. While the house burned, comma. See that comma there? Sort of. I kind of covered it with ink. While the house burned, that's a dependent clause. He laughed and laughed and laughed, which is an independent clause. Also, side note, this is also an example of the literary device called polysyndeton, because we have more conjunctions than we need. Because you could just say he laughed, laughed, and laughed. Though, and this is also often used for emphasis, you can also know that we're emphasizing him laughing here because we say he laughed 3 times, even though we really only need to say it once. But again, that's done for emphasis, as well as the polysyndeton, the repetition of and, is done for emphasis. So dependent plus independent clause, complex sentence. Vortex refused to give Miss Dell the book, although Miss Dell was starving. No prepositional phrases, but to give is our infinitive there. Infinitives can often be messed up with prepositional phrases. It's not a big deal because usually they're not subjects anyway. But it's good to always think and try to look for that noun of the preposition, because if you look, to give, it's not going to have a noun of the preposition there because it's an infinitive phrase. It's just going to have to, and then if it's not split infinitive, to, and then the verb. So vortex refused. Refuses are another verb. Miss Dell the book, although Miss Dell was starving. More verbs. Who refused? Vortex did. Who was starving? Miss Dell was. All right, so vortex refused to give Miss Dell the book. Stand by itself, independent. Although is a key word here. Although Miss Dell was starving, cannot stand by itself. Dependent, you have independent plus dependent clause, complex sentence. Ronald will have red hair until the kingdom comes. No prepositional phrases, no infinitives. Will have, those are some verbs. We also have comes is another verb. What comes? Kingdom. Who will have? Ronald. Ronald will have red hair. Stand by itself, independent clause, until the kingdom comes. Dependent cannot stand by itself, and you have that until there. We'll box it for right now. That until there kind of gives us that hint that this is not going to be able to stand by itself. Independent plus dependent clause, complex sentence. All right, the fourth and final type of sentence, compound complex sentences. Example, by the way, compound complex sentences are when you have more than one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. Examples, while she laughed, he smiled, but I cried. No infinitives, no prepositional phrases. Verbs, laughed, smiled, cried. Who cried? I did. Who smiled? He did. Who laughed? She did. While she laughed, comma there, indicating we should probably stop and take note. Kind of like a yield sign. Just hold up a minute, we need to look at some stuff. So while she laughed is dependent. He smiled, comma, conjunction, right? Again, that's like a comma and then a conjunction usually tells you it's a stop sign. You really need to stop and look around. He smiled is independent, but I cried is independent, dependent, independent, compound complex. Although Bella loathed graveyards, she loved dead guys and she drank blood. No prepositional phrases, no infinitives, but we have loathed as a verb, loathed, loved, and drank, which all wonderful verbs to put together, right? Who loathed Bella? Who loved? She did. Who drank? She did. Although Bella loathed graveyards, comma, yield sign. Although Bella loved graveyards, dependent. She loved dead guys, comma, yield sign. Oh, we got an and, so it's actually a stop. So this is an independent clause. She loved dead guys and she drank blood. Another independent. Dependent, independent, compound complex. Mother always said I would be a loser until I grew a beard, yet she adored my father's baldness. This is quite a weird sentence. First of all, let's look for any infinitives or prepositional phrases, which I'm not seeing any here, so let's look for our verbs. Said, would be, grew, adored. Who adored? She did. Who grew? I did. Who would be? I would be. Who said? Mother said. Mother always said. Now, this is a bit tricky sentence because there's actually an implied word here. There's an implied that. Mother always said that I would be a loser. Mother always said is actually an independent clause. It can stand by itself. That I would be a loser is dependent until I grew a beard. Comma, stop sign because you also have a conjunction there. So this is another dependent until I grew a beard, yet she adored my father's baldness. Independent, she adored my father's baldness. So we have independent, dependent, independent, compound, complex sentence. And when you're reading this, I kind of sped through it, you're wondering why, how in the world is she able to say, well, this is dependent, that's dependent, this is independent, that was implied. This all comes down to being familiar enough with sentences and sentence structure to say, well, technically that should be there. And if that is there, it's giving us that is giving us the indication that we have a dependent clause. Because when you start with that, generally speaking, you have a dependent clause. There are exceptions, but generally speaking, you have a dependent clause. Same with when you start with until, or while, although. Those are some key words that tell you, hey, listen up, you probably have a dependent clause coming up. And sure enough, that we have a dependent clause. Until, dependent clause, although, while. All key words telling us there's a dependent clause coming up. Let's put it all together. Fortunately, not only my mother and I, but also little boy Blue walked to the store, and we all got ice cream cones while Bo Peep looked for sheep. So first, prepositional phrases. For sheep, to the store. Just to check to make sure the prepositional phrases, we got store for our noun of the prep, and sheep for our noun of the preposition. We got a couple conjunctions I just want to highlight because they're pretty cool. Not only, but also, they're partner conjunctions. They go together. And we have and, also conjunction. Ooh, comma and, another conjunction there. Fortunately, not only my mother and I, but also Little Boy Blue walked is our verb, to the store, and we all got, another verb, ice cream cones while Bo Peep looked, another verb. Who looked? Bo Peep. Who got? We. Who walked? Little Boy Blue, mother, and I. All right, fortunately, not only my mother and I, but also Little Boy Blue walked to the store. That comma, conjunction, all right, giving us a heads up. We got an independent clause right there. We all got ice cream cones while. Well, while is a keyword. Cut this off. We all got ice cream cones is independent. While Bo Peep looked for sheep is dependent. Independent plus dependent. We have a compound, complex sentence. Whew. So we went through a lot of examples about different sentence structures. If you want to see more, please just say something below in the comments. We will be going more into how to diagram sentences in later videos and how to identify all those parts of speech. We did not identify all of them in all of the sentences, but we did go over most of the parts of sentences. So I hope this helped. See you next time.